Hi, I'm Maria Stuart. I teach at University College in Dublin, where I work in American literature and in the relatively recent field of dysfluency studies, which is an approach to stammering that draws together different disciplines, including cultural and creative practice. I am someone who stammers, and perhaps as a part of that, I've always been really drawn to textual and literary stammers. And I'm really looking forward today to exploring some of those textual literary stammers and voices with Daniel here, where we'll be looking at particularly at 19th century approaches to dysfluency.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Martin. I am an associate professor of English literature at MacEwan University here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, where I teach Victorian literature and culture, and recently courses in stuttering, stammering, and dysfluency. I also teach in literary and critical theory, so really like complicated philosophical ideas about literature that no one needs to really know in the first place. Yeah, in my research, I've been focusing on literary, cultural, and medical representations of stuttered speech in the 19th century, primarily in the British and American context, but mostly in the British context. And I'm really excited about our conversation today. And let's get it started.
Thanks, Daniel. So I suppose our main kind of question here that we're exploring is what makes the 19th century in particular such an interesting place and space to explore understandings and representations of dysfluent speech. Where would you like to enter that field?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because if we think about the history of stuttering as from a medical or biological and medical point of view, right? We often think of the rise of speech language therapy as a kind of like our beginning point, and that kind of institutional rise of speech language pathology or speech language therapy really has its origins in the early to mid 20th century. So it's a relatively relatively new process. But that doesn't mean that throughout the 19th century, even back into the 18th century, that we don't have a vast archive of materials about the causes and cures for stuttered speech. And one of the things I find especially compelling about the 19th century is that when we look back into the historical record, the the material about speech language therapy, causes and cures for stuttered speech, really kind of echoes or reflects broader 19th century, or in my case, Victorian concerns about what it means to be modern. Uh, Modernity in the Victorian period is a very complicated process. If you think about throughout the 19th century, we have the rise of incredible, rapid rise of print media, transportation networks like railway networks, the rise of the telegraph and postal system. This is an age of uh, rapidly accelerating technology. At the same time, as a lot of Victorian social critics and poets and literary writers of the century were beginning to understand, it was also an age of transition, right? Between kind of an older worldview where it had a kind of like a religious or Christian kind of centrality to it, and an increasingly secular modern age. I find this period really fascinating to study because those periods of transitions have their inconsistencies, their contradictions. You can really see that in the rise of elocutionary and medical thought about speech, voice, and what counts as proper or healthy speech. For example, in this 19th century, there's no medical or scientific institutionalization for speech language therapy. What we get instead are a whole range of competing theories about cause and cure from elocutionists, medical experts, and all of that material is increasingly available in mass digitization efforts like Google Books. So it's just an incredibly rich and complicated archive.
I really like the way you position the 19th century as a period of flux and change, because I think that's really important to that whole sense of the emergence of the 19th century, the different stages, the complexity, the contradiction that's very much there. So I think you situate it in a way that really helps to give a context to the very conflicting responses we're going to be looking at a bit today. I think the richness of that complexity and that contradiction. One of the things that really struck me was just thinking about, for example, the rise of new thinking about the brain, the part of the brain that's involved in producing articulated speech. I'm thinking of Chris Eagle's work on Paul Pierre Broca. So Broca finds the site of speech production in the brain in the left hemisphere. So there's that sense of what we might think of as scientific knowledge, new knowledge coming into play, but it doesn't displace all those other ways of understanding dysfluency that you're talking about. And as far as I can see, it's a new neurological approach to dysfluency and to aphasia and to stammering, but it doesn't silence all those other voices in elocutionary practice, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I think that the reference your reference there to Chris Eagle's work is really compelling because Eagle's book Dysfluencies is one of the few scholarly textbooks or books that we have currently about uh, that connection between literary and cultural representations and experiences of stuttered speech, and this is one of the things I really love about this century because it's so understudied because of and I think in part it's because throughout the 19th century you have so many competing theories and models of what counts as a healthy voice. You have the elocutionists who really begin their work in the late 18th century and begin to promote essentially almost like quick fix causes and cures, like fix your stutter within 10 minutes or come and take my training program and I will cure you within a matter of days. And then you have the medical experts who increasingly react against those medical those elocutionary models, arguing that so many of their promotions of a type of cure are even worse than stuttering in the first place. And what I find so fascinating is that you begin to see these in those competitions and competing theories. You really do see kind of echoes of our 20th century speech language therapy or speech language pathology, right? Like the difference between stuttering modification and fluency shaping. What is the value of what is the most effective strategy for producing fluency? And in those competing theories, you also then have the medical experts and the surgeons in the 1840s who begin to promote surgical theories based on their increasing kind of kooky and strange theories about how to fix stutters, cut out tonsils, uh, remove parts of the tongue, and this will supposedly induce fluency of some kind. Uh, those materials are complicated and they don't flow in a kind of like a simple historical pattern, right? They require mapping and thinking about networks, and that's what makes it such an incredibly complex period.
I think one of the things I know your work, Josephine Hogarth's work, Riley McGuire's work, is very interested in this kind of mapping out. And it is very much a sense that even as maybe the medical or scientific practitioners, even on the one hand, they like to label the elocutionists as quacks, they're
Mhm.
still absorbing aspects from that practice because those manuals were popular. They were read. They were that kind of thinking around modification and exercises, that they were sort of being read and there was traction around it. So you get that kind of fusion, that blurring of the medical and the elocutionary, or the scientific and the elocutionary, happening all over the place.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's what makes this period so fascinating to study. Also, really challenging to study, right? Because especially if you dig into the literary, cultural, and medical relationships between these kinds of texts, we start to see that these medical experts or elocutionists have they're not just these obscure writers who are writing these treatises and textbooks that only people who stutter or only experts read, but they have tremendous cultural purchase as well. Especially if you think about like an elocutionist or medical expert like James Hunt, who worked with Lewis Carroll, Charles Kingsley, anecdotally one of Alfred Tennyson's children, one of Charles Dickens' children. These are these kinds of theories that get promoted, especially in the 1850s, 1860s, have an incredible kind of cultural purchase. And I was wondering if we could maybe like switch our conversation a little bit more towards that side of the cultural component, because we've been looking at like the medical and the technological sort of aspect of stuttered speech in this period as a kind of like as a kind of modernity that is also complicated, but also nestled alongside the sense of speech and voice and its industrialization and modernization. We also have we're still working with a period of in which culture is infused tremendously with the spiritual, the religious, the spectral, and the supernatural. And Maria, I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in some ways almost commonplace to say that Victorian literature, 19th century literature, is on both sides of the Atlantic, in particular, is infused with the language and the cadences of the King James Bible. And I think sometimes that's thought of as a superficial thing, perhaps, that the emphasis is sometimes on the 19th century as an increasingly secular culture. But I tend to think more of it as a kind of a friction at work between that secular religious understanding and definitely a more increased, and the legacies, if you like, of that more religious culture. And I'm particularly interested in 19th century America in terms of the legacies of the Puritan conversion narrative. And it may seem quite an obscure thing to be reaching back to, but I think it has still an impact in the 19th century, particularly in America. So the conversion narrative was one of the foundational texts of white colonial America, this idea that you would testify to your place in the so-called New World by articulating an experience of grace, of religion, of being chosen. And what emerged from those texts was a real suspicion of overly fluent language. Fluency was something that was suspect. And I'm just interested in the ways in which I think perhaps that is still at play within 19th century culture, even as we see the rise of elocutionary texts that seem to be telling us what the norms of language are, that seem to be trying to regulate speech. I think there's still that legacy of a kind of suspicion of the overly fluent. I'm thinking of the critic Gilbert Seldes in 1927 called the 19th century the stammering century. And he sort of said that the orators of the 19th century, like Daniel Webster, they were the orators of progress and advancement, but stammering spoke to the soul of America. So I think there's just still that sense that even though fluency seems aligned with progress and advancement and fits into an increasingly industrial society, there seems to be still that anxiety or concern that what happens beneath that, and that maybe it's disruptions of fluent speech that maybe are better tuned to expressing that. And I mean, I've thought of that as interesting in terms of the work of a poet like Emily Dickinson, because I sort of see in her poetry a kind of harnessing of the expressive power of dysfluent speech. So I think of her lyric speakers, those speakers of her poetry, as quite disruptive and dysfluent. I love the way I think she takes grammar and punctuation that are usually in the service of smoothing fluent speech and increasing fluency, and she breaks grammatical rules. There's her Dickinson dash, introduces a pause and a hesitation into, and her poems are speaking voices, often speaking directly to us, and those voices are brilliantly disrupted by dashes, and we don't know the length of those as we read them. And I can't help but, I think hearing that some attention to ideas of vocal blocks, and being held in that moment. So I think there's in her work, I'm not trying to suggest she was a stammerer, but I think there's an example of a 19th century poetry that was interrogating fluency and opening up space for dysfluency, for pause, for hesitation, and speaking that's kind of out of tune with both the rhythms of her poetry and perhaps with cultural norms around the importance of fluency.
Absolutely, I really like that point. And one of the reasons why I like what you just said is because that little hesitation about we're not sure, like, was Emily Dickinson a person who stutters or stammers? We have no record, no evidence, but that doesn't mean that the poetic engagement, so the poetic richness, isn't gesturing towards a broader kind of fascination with the dysfluent, that which doesn't follow standardized, homogenized language patterns or expressive patterns. And it even reminds me of like a writer in in the English context, right? Robert Browning, who in the if you, I don't in the late 19th century, Oscar Wilde famously referred to Robert Browning as a poet who could stammer in 1,000 voices, because Robert Browning's poetry was often producing dramatic monologues. So Browning rarely speaks or writes in his own poetic voice, but adopts the voices of an endless range of dramatists or characters, sometimes gesturing back into the Italian Renaissance, other times from other cultural records. And one of the things that Browning does, I think, is very different than Dickinson, but also kind of similar, is that there's a really strong fascination with unconventional language, unconventional intonations and voices and sounds that come out of our mouths. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about this tension, because both these poets are not poets that we would recognize as people who stutter or stammer. But it does raise an interesting question about those texts in the 19th century that do include or reference characters who we might today identify as people who stutter. And from my experience, they're quite rare, right? Sure, there are some major texts, and maybe we can talk about some of these. But like when we look at stuttering in the 19th century, we're also looking at representations of stuttering culturally, spiritually, expressively, but also looking at characters who stutter and stammer. And Maria, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that interesting kind of connection, or that disconnection here between um, texts that stutter and representations of people who identify as stammerers or stutterers. I
I mean,
have
I
some
think,
ideas too, but I'll push it back to you first, and then we'll go from there.
well, I suppose I was interested, I think, in your work, and others that suggest that we've had this wonderful volume of scientific, elocutionary, sort of non-fictional sort of explorations of stammering, and maybe we're not seeing that complexity and that nuance when we turn to the literature. And we're talking, with Browning and Dickinson, it's more their use of stammering, perhaps.
Yeah.
Although I do think with Dickinson, there's a sense of her being attuned to embodiment, to what it feels, to speak. But yeah, so when we come to look at specific characters, my sense of it is that there does seem to be a kind of a familiar cast, and at one end of those is perhaps the comic a character who stammers, and I'm thinking in particular of Riley Maguire's reading of that mid 19th century play, Our American Cousin,
Mhm.
which was a huge success on both sides of the Atlantic and was about really a clash of cultures and mores, but also speech and language. And Riley talks a lot about the huge popularity of the stammering figure of Lord Dundreary, and how
Yeah.
such was the popularity that his character grew and his speaking time grew. And so there was a real sense of a cultural response to that, which I think Riley suggests exceeds just mockery, just comic mockery, that there is something subversive, an attraction to the energy of dysfluency. But he's also, I think, very clear in saying it didn't seem to cross over from the stage into more general cultural views of stammering. It didn't translate into more acceptance of dysfluency off stage. So I suppose those have been the kind of characters that I've been more familiar with. I don't know, Daniel, what you see and hear there.
Yeah. So one of the things I really love about that figure of Lord Dundreary is that not simply just the representation of stuttered speech in Our American Cousin, the play, but also just that idea of Dundrearyism, which becomes such a common kind of like a catchphrase throughout Victorian popular journalism and comic and satirical magazines like Punch magazine, for example. Dundrearyism becomes this kind of catchphrase throughout the second half of the 19th century for language that stutters and stammers, but in comic ways, right? And I find that incredibly fascinating. At the same time, though, like, for such a period, for a period that's so rich with medical theories about cause and cure for stuttered speech, and so rich with jokes about stuttering, about stammering, and so rich in a kind of like the tradition of comic or comedic writers about stuttered speech and those moments when speech becomes something other than itself, right? Which creates the condition for a joke or a punchline. Despite this rich vastness of the archive, there actually are strangely very few literary representations of characters who actually stutter or stammer. Like some of the ones I'm thinking of are Martin Tupper's poem, The Stammerer's Complaint from 1838, which is kind of like an iambic pentameter, very kind of like simplistic, formulaic poem about Tupper's own anxieties about his own speaking voice. The poem was ripped to shreds by critics in the late 1830s and early 1840s, as was Tupper's work in general. In fact, he was so like criticized as a Philistine throughout the 19th century that even Karl Marx, in a footnote to to his major book on Capital, has takes a jab at Tupper, calls him one of Britain's greatest Philistines, and it's unfortunate because despite for a culture that is so rich with literary and cultural uh, experimentation with languages that glitch and stutter and break down, there still is running throughout the century a kind of like dismissal of people who actually stutter and stammer.
Are you talking in some ways about how brief the reference can be? Just those like textual markers like he, she stuttered or stammered, but no
Yeah,
real kind of representation of the embodied
yeah,
experience or the interiority.
yeah. I think one of the ways I like to think about it is that for in this century, the stutter is everywhere. It's pervasive of 19th century culture. But characters who stutter in fiction, in poetry, like actual like who identify as people who stutter are few and far between, and very rarely do they take on those heroic positions. If they are characters who stutter, they are often comic figures, minor characters in a Charles Dickens novel or a Wilkie Collins novel or a Mary Elizabeth Braddon novel, like popular writers who introduce um, a character who stutters, but for almost a kind of comic relief, right? But we do also have other major works like Herman Melville's Billy Budd, which you and I were talking about beforehand, a text that we both have some kind I don't know if we struggle with it, but it's a complicated representation of a character who stutters. There are also in the popular mode, James Malcolm Reimer's book, The Unspeakable, which is a fictional autobiography of a character who stammers. Later in the 19th century, Lucas Mallet's book, The Wages of Sin, which is a book that was a major influence on Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. That novel situates an artist who stutters at the center of kind of social controversy around his relations with two women. And of course, in that work, the stutter is treated as an artist figure, but almost in a tragic mode, right? Which is rare for literary representation to think about the stutter as a kind of in a tragic mode. Same thing, but at the same time, though, what these texts seem to do is they tend to echo and reflect the elocutionary and medical tradition. They borrow the language from these medical textbooks to develop and flesh out their characters. So in a weird kind of way, they tend to have this kind of like rather than an authenticity, they're kind of like these characters who echo the language of the medical textbooks throughout the 19th century, which seems to lessen the kind of the fascination of them.
I mean, it's interesting what you say, because there is that sense once you're reading for dysfluency in the 19th century, it seems so pervasive. You do see it in speeches. I'm thinking of Henry James as a writer who did stammer. You know,
Mm-hmm.
his conversations between people, they're so self-consciously about articulation and impediments to understanding and articulation, but they're not at the level of an identifiable type of stammer. And so you do get, I think, this in a lot of Victorian literature, you get a kind of a gesture towards dysfluency, but not fleshed out in terms of an embodied type of experience. So it seems as almost as if it's suggestively there. And when you go to look for the speech itself, it isn't there in some way, except obviously for Billy Budd, as we said, Melville is so ambiguous in how he treats Billy's stutter. It's both almost like a stain on his character, slightly almost the sign of the devil in a kind of a theologically kind of inflected way.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's also a sign of his lack of corruption, you know, that he doesn't or he cannot lie because of his dysfluency, and therefore he becomes almost elevated to a kind of uncorruptible figure. So I think there's just all this interest, but maybe not in a way that's an identifiable type of representation of a stutterer. And it is, as you say, quite striking, because some of those elocutionary texts have a lot of time and space for the psychology of the person who stammers. They often were written by people who stammered. So you have this kind of space there for a kind of an exploration of sort of a psychological and interior and social and cultural life that maybe in literature less explicit. It's there, but maybe there's a less explicit.
I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And I wanted to use this moment as a kind of chance to kind of to maybe introduce another set of questions here, because you mentioned Henry James, and that really kind of sparked my interest there. So I was wondering what this is, because it's a really fascinating question, right? Like, what did good speech sound like in the 19th century, and what sorts of like what we call in kind of philosophy biosocial norms was good speech defined by? It's a really complicated question. I think in our own times, incredibly complicated. But for the 19th century, especially for the Victorians, this question of good speech and its relation to social status is incredibly pervasive. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that idea of kind of a national idea of proper speech, maybe in Henry James' work or elsewhere in the 19th century.
I think James is a good kind of concrete example, and maybe particularly interesting because this is a writer who did stammer himself, who had an intimate personal experience of stammering. And he writes an essay in 1905 called The Question of Our Speech. And it's kind of a State of the Nation address on the decline of English in America. So he sort of paints this picture of problems with pronunciation, with dialect, sort of a kind of corruption of quote unquote proper speech by not just Americans, but he situates it in relation to a rising tide of immigrants arriving in America. So it's an image of a kind of defective speech or improper speech that is racialized, in really discriminatory ways, and also class. They're very much elements of class and ideas of the foreign, almost infecting ideas of proper speech. It's interesting because I think in general in literature, stammering is associated with kind of the upper class. Those are the pictures of the representations we have. But what I find fascinating about it is, even though you recoil from the way he seems to be projecting onto immigrant peoples this idea of defective speech, he talks about it in terms of a stumbling speech, and there's an intimacy in how he talks about it, which makes you feel he's also channeling his own struggles with stammering within a culture of which he was out of sync with the norms. So he talks about syllables, it's that elocutionary echo you're talking about, Daniel, that's there. He talks about almost the level of syllables that are being distorted as he feels now, but you can hear something of the intimate experience of a person who stammers with language, with impediment. So it's a really contradictory type of representation, but it does signpost ideas of proper speech in terms of race and class.
Yeah, and I think that whole element of race and class really complicates this century, especially the second half of the 19th century, when you begin to see that very, especially in British culture, but to less extent American culture, right? This rise of kind of like a national sort of a sense of Britain as an empire, right? As a colonial power in the world. It's so complicated because you also look at like in the 1860s, which also is the rise of like the eugenics movement, and you start to see these writers like James Hunt again, for example, I've referred to earlier, in one of his last published edition of his major work, Stuttering and Stammering, in 1870, which was completed after his death by one of his colleagues, who was a really close friend with Lewis Carroll. But that takes us away from what I'm talking about here. He writes this concluding paragraph, or sorry, chapter, where he mentions the complications to theories of cause and cure. Do other cultures outside of Europe stutter or stammer? And one of the things that James really struggles with is the realization from ethnographers coming back from Africa that there actually is evidence of people who stutter on the African continent, which completely contradicts James Hunt's belief that stuttering is a kind of a disease of civilization. And so one of the ways he kind of circumnavigates this ethnographic evidence is by arguing that people in Africa aren't actually people who stutter, but they're fashionably imitating British soldiers or British ethnographers because of their own stuttered speech. It becomes a kind of fashion point. So African stuttering is performative, not actually a significant part of various African languages. It creates so many complications and tensions. And what I really love about that is it kind of unsettles our kind of assumptions about a kind of a long-standing biomedical tradition of exploring stutter speech. The biomedical tradition gets into problems about race and class and even sexual difference. It's incredibly complicated and really fascinating.
I think there's so much there, what you're saying. I think also that idea, yeah, in a strange way, the stigma of stuttering, if that's using it modern terminology, perhaps, but the fact that it was both something that people would, in the 19th century, would feel compelled to cure because of a sense of it not being socially acceptable or productive. But yet also that alignment of it with a register of the upper class or the civilized world just complicates that too in many ways. Um, I was thinking, just as you were talking about that intersection of class and race, I think your work and Josephine's points to that. You said a kind of a strain of eugenics that underlies that elocutionary practice. There is a vocabulary, isn't there, around vocal health and fitness in a lot of those books. That is really troubling too.
It really is, yeah. And I have so much to say about that topic. So I don't know if I keep on looking at the clock and thinking,
I know we
how are we
don't
going to
have
wrap
enough
this all
time in
up?
this format,
But
but I do think that idea of a vocal gymnastics and a kind of a sort of a rigorous masculinity is also part of what's being preached in terms of how to cure stammering.
yeah, and I think that's what we tend to forget too, is that uh, even in our own times, we still do not have a kind of a definitive sense of a cause or even a cure for stuttered or stammered speech. Same thing in the 19th century, although it's really fascinating. If you look back in the 19th century, we start to see like early statistics, right? Some of those statistics are very similar to our own times, right? About the proportion of men to women who stutter, stuttering's relationship to left-handedness, the stuttering in relation to class and class difference. These are very prominent themes in the 19th century.
And they
But
run
it
right
also,
through to the present
yeah,
day.
right. But that eugenic element is really fascinating because that's really where, in our own times, we start to see kind of like the rise of disability studies, right, and its influence on our field of study, dysfluency studies. Um, this idea of bodies or voices that need to be corrected or cured. That project, that mission is so incredibly central to so many of the elocutionary textbooks especially throughout the second half of the 19th century. And I'm thinking primarily of the work of Alexander Melville Bell, father of Alexander Graham Bell, in their work with deaf cultures and deaf communities, but also Melville Bell's belief that if we focus on proper, correct enunciation and articulation, the placement of the mouth, we can cure all dysfluencies, all stutters and stammers, all irregularities of speech. But what you get is this, not this kind of like, this aha moment for science, like we've done it, we've solved all the problems. But I think what we get instead is this sense of the problems of that dream of a kind of a singularity of voice, right? That the voice can be the same for every person, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, that we can have a standard way of speaking. And of course, that kind of model of a kind of universal voice that we all have access to, it just completely destroys the richness of language, the richness of speech. And that's the fascinating thing, is that I think as you and our work suggests, is that the century is so productive of richness of speech and voice in poetry and literature that you get those tensions.
I also was reminded as you spoke there, Daniel, of one of the speech therapists you talk about who is really alert in the 19th century to that idea of the cost of a universal type of speech. I think you talk at one stage of, in one sense, you could call elocutionists in the 19th century kind of the engineers of speech. There's an idea that speech, perhaps like the industrial kind of workplace, should be smoothly, mechanically flowing, and stammering kind of just sort of disrupts that flow of commerce and productivity. But I'm forgetting the name of the speech therapist you talked to, but he draws attention to the problems of a mechanized speech, all the
Yeah,
individuality that's lost in
yeah.
pursuit of fluency and a norm.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of, but probably there, I'm thinking of like a medical expert like Henry Monroe from the
Yes,
1850s.
it is. Yeah.
His book on stammering. So Henry Monroe is a really interesting figure, like an alienist at the time period, sort of an emergent psychologist who writes this book under a pseudonym about causes and cures for stuttered speech. And one of the things he challenges is the persistence of elocutionary models, right? That if we that and those elocutionary models are very similar to kind of some of the techniques that speech language therapists and pathologists use today, right? Like,
Yes.
so one of the things, one of the models of elocutionary cure that Monroe challenges is this idea that if you're blocking or studying on a word, just add a kind of a word to the that you're blocking on to kind of get your speech up. So the word he uses is right? So if I'm stuttering, I would add an to get my words out. And one of the things he argues is that model of a kind of that assumption of a kind of like that we can all enter into mechanical regimes of re-educating and redeveloping our normal speech. What you end up getting are speakers who don't speak with a natural intonation. They start to sound like in what we call in our own times robots, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a sort of a mechanical nature of the speech that Monroe argues is just as off-putting as the stutter in the first place. So it creates this, and I think for people who stutter, I think we all recognize this kind of this conundrum, right? The more I find fluency in my own voice, the more I feel kind of really less authentic about my own speaking voice. And I
That's
think,
what was that was fascinating, was to find that articulated in the 19th century,
yeah,
in ways that are ahead of some of the thoughts around this in even the 20th century. There's a ways in which the 19th century, has these moments that really look ahead and speak to our own moment in really surprising ways.
yeah, which I think is that should probably bring us to our last question of the day. I'm guessing. I know we've rushed through a lot of material, and I hope we can have other chances to talk about this material. But like that is a core question for us, right? As how can this rich history help us think about speech disability or what we could speech dysfluencies in the present moment in our own times today? Maria, do you want to just maybe launch us towards a conclusion here by beginning a kind of response to that question?
I mean, there's so many things I think that I find just even on a conversation thinking, but I think in some ways, I'm thinking of Josh, that's in Pierre's work on the idea of time, how the present moment in a late capitalist society, it seems that we're under increasing pressure to be time efficient, and that
Hmm.
disciplined speech is somehow an impediment to
Spit
productive.
it out.
Yeah,
Get to the
spit it out.
point. We've all
Exactly.
heard these kinds of
Oh, and they
refrains
seem to
before.
be, as Josh has said, and Kevin Patterson has worked on the idea of time as well, that part of one of the real focal points, I think, for stuttering activism and pushing against societal norms is to challenge the idea of time, the way in which stuttering speech seems to be completely contained within these artificial ideas of enough time. And I think that for me, that's really interesting because you can see the roots of that in the 19th century with the rise of capitalism and the factories and the industrialized labor, beginning that process of regulating people in terms of being time productive. And so that's a way in which I think the 19th century for me continues to speak to the crisis we're having now in terms of the pressure on our speech, on social media, talking heads, all of those
Yeah.
to be increasingly quick. I think
Hmm.
there's an increasing intolerance that makes an activist focus on demanding more time really important.
Yeah. And I think in some ways our conversation today, which is way over time, is probably an indicator of this, right? Like how are we going to even post this video? It's gone way beyond the time that we set out for ourselves. But like, how could it be otherwise? This
How
this
can it be
this,
otherwise?
this
Yeah,
material is so rich and so fascinating. For me, when I look at like, why am I interested in the 19th century? One of the things I find so fascinating is that the medical and the literary and the cultural tradition is so fraught with weird theories of cause and cure throughout the 19th century, right? Like, so many strange theories. But increasingly throughout the 19th century, you also are beginning to see the origins or the emergence of what we call in disability studies today, a medical model for the voice. And that medical model, though, which we have in our own as a kind of core framework for disability studies today, right? Like, in disability studies, the medical model has its problems, right? And its assumptions about what counts as a normal, natural, or healthy body or voice. But when you look back into the history of what we call so singularly the medical model today, right? When we look back in the history, that model itself, it comes out of a really complicated history of competing theories of cause and cure. And in the 19th century, so many of those theories actually, if you look at them and study them, they begin to challenge this idea that the body itself or the voice itself is this unitary thing that can be standardized and rendered efficient for all speaking people. What we get instead are these strange theories of that stuttering is contagious, for example, that one stutterer can actually infect a whole community of other people, of children especially, and render them um, stutterers. This is a theory that goes throughout the 19th century. It's called the imitative theory, that stuttering is contracted by imitation of other speaking voices. But what's so compelling about that theory is that it creates this assumption that the body or the speaking subject is not just this singularly contained unitary thing that the medical model kind of promotes for bodies and voices, but rather is this porous um, body that picks up strands and patterns of voices and dialects and references from other bodies. That we create, what we really get is a sense of a kind of a social body throughout the 19th century. And I think in many ways that's partially why the 19th century is so understudied in terms of like a history of speech and voice, because it has so many, the theories are so cacophonous in their differences, and they don't follow or lead up to historically what we call the medical model today.
That's really interesting. So the whole idea of fighting the medical model with awareness of the social or the political relational ideas of the self, you find roots of that in the Victorian, idea of
Yeah.
the body as messy and porous, and and I think
And not just the body, but also voices, right? This is like
voices,
this is a stammering century, as we mentioned earlier, right? Like, this is a period that has a tremendous rise in speaking voices, print culture, print media, telephones, telegraphs. The idea of a voice, a singular voice, is so incredibly complicated in this period.
and that fights back against a medical model that sees us as it's an individual problem, quote unquote.
Yeah,
One has to fix oneself, and all that we're talking
yeah,
about in terms of the wonderful frenetic messiness of the 19th century really complicates that. The other thing I might end with, Daniel, just is that I think we're at a place now where intersectionality has become really important to how we think about an experience of dysfluency and attitudes to dysfluency. And I might um, just name check Jerome Ellis's work on 19th century slave experiences. He looks a lot at a fraught archive of advertisements for so-called runaway or fugitive slaves that foreground the experience of dysfluency as part of that enslaved and fugitive experience. So again, there's so much material in the 19th century, I think, that speaks to our present moment.
yeah.
So maybe
I,
perhaps we have to draw today to a close, do you think?
I think maybe we should just we'll hit the pause button on the recording, and our audience can just assume that we're just going to continue the conversation for hours and hours after this, once we've stopped the recording.
That sounds a
I
great idea. And I'd just say as well, we've been this has been a conversation of our voices, but also we've been including the voices of other people who enrich this field and are working in this field. So again, very much suggest to anyone listening who's interested that there's lots of material and voices out there to explore in your own time.
Yeah, that's probably it for now. Hey,
That's us.
should we
Thanks.
say goodbye to everybody? Take care. Thank you for listening.